Now, during this series, we're going to be asking this question. How do we build a future church that is worth passing on to the future generation? How do we build a future church that is worth passing on to the future generation? Now, I want you to imagine this with me. Close your eyes even, wherever you are. It's the year 2032. It's 1 decade from now. What do you think the church will look like? During this series, we'll be looking 10 years into the future and asking that question. What does the future church look like, and how can we at Canvas participate with what God is doing in the future of the church? And we're asking this because we want to be a part of building a future church that is worth passing on to a future generation. But before we can talk about the future church, we first need to talk a little bit about wine. Now, if you go to Napa or Sonoma all the time, I know I got your attention. But we need to talk about wine first. In Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is talking to religious leaders, and like usual, the religious leaders are frustrated with Jesus, and they're frustrated with Jesus because he and his disciples are not following the standard religious protocols regarding fasting. In other words, the religious leaders come to Jesus and they say, "This is how we've always done this, Jesus. So why aren't you and why aren't your disciples doing what's always been done?" And what I want you to hear is Jesus' response back in Matthew chapter 9. He says, "No one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the old skins would burst from the pressure, spilling the wine and ruining the skins. New wine is stored in new wineskins so that both are preserved." So Jesus here in Matthew chapter 9, he essentially says, God is up to something new. And this new thing that God is doing won't fit in the old methods that you've always done. And then Jesus talks about new wine. And if you're not a Hebrew in the time of Jesus, you might miss what he's really saying. You see, this phrase, new wine, is hyperlinked to a popular Hebrew idiom about God's blessing. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, new wine is synonymous with God's blessing. But the wine metaphor doesn't really stop there, because in the world of Jesus, the idea of putting new wine in old wineskins would have been seen as foolish. It would have been seen as wasteful, because the old wineskins would have lacked flexibility. They would have been so set as they were that new wine would cause them to crack open and the wine would spill everywhere. So you would put new wine in new wineskins. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying to these religious leaders, hey, God is doing a new thing. God is pouring out a new blessing. But because you do not have the flexibility, because you are so focused on what you've always done and how you've always done it, you are at risk of missing the new thing that God is doing in the world. Now, this begs the question, is there something new that God is wanting to pour into your life? And is your inflexibility keeping you from receiving it? And I wonder, is there something new that God is wanting to pour into the church, into our church? But if we are inflexible, then we might be at risk of missing it. See, I'm convinced that if you want to have a life and live a life of faithfulness, but don't want to be flexible, then you don't really want a life of faithfulness, right? Because when God calls people to follow him, when God invites people into a life of faithfulness, God always calls them outside of their comfort zones. God will always call them beyond the borders of their competence. And if you don't believe me, if you don't believe faithfulness demands flexibility, just ask Abraham and Sarah. Read the story of Esther or David or Mary or Joseph or Peter or Paul. I mean, the list goes on. If you want to be a part of the new that God is doing, what we always see is that you are going to have to be faithful to the mission, but remain flexible to the method. But what does this have to do with the future church? Well, a lot, actually. So good question. And I know what I'm about to say might sound hyperbolic, but I'm still going to say it anyways, and I'm going to allow time to be the judge. But I truly believe that the church, the global church, is in the midst of the greatest cultural and historical, methodological, and ecclesiological shift since Gutenberg printed the first Bible in 1456. Yeah, I know every generation experiences change, but sometimes you sense that you're in the midst of a truly radical change, the kind that only happens every few centuries. And I think that we might just be in such a moment right now for the church. And the question that needs to be answered is, what does that actually mean for the future church? Will the future church try and use the old wineskins to hold the new wine of God's blessing? Or is God inviting us into a sacred and flexible space to be stretched and reshaped in order to hold the new that God is wanting to do in the church and through the church in this moment? And so I want to talk about the following three things. I want to talk about three cultural trends that we need to recognize. I want to talk about three takeaways we need to reflect on, and then one truth to remember as we seek to be the kind of vessels that can carry the new wine, the new blessing, the new thing that God is doing in the church and in the world. Three trends, three takeaways, one truth. Let's start with the trends. The first trend I think we need to be paying attention to as we build the future church is that cultural Christianity in America is a thing of the past. Once upon a time, Christianity made up the cultural majority in America. In fact, those of us who are over the age of 30 years old, we were born into a culture that could conceivably be called Christian. Now, in this day, in this moment, according to Barna Group, Americans who have no church affiliation will soon eclipse those who are churched. And in 2021, Gallup shared that for the first time ever, church membership dropped below 50% nationally. And this is the first time since this stat had been recorded decades ago. And among millennials, only 36% identify with the church. And at this point, it shows no signs of slowing down. And many of you know this already, or at least you feel this, like at your workplace, because many of you have told me how you feel like you don't know anyone else at your job that is actually a follower of Jesus, but then you find out somebody in your office or in the cubicle next to you is a follower of Jesus, and now there's this secret society of Christians formed in your workplace. You have secret signs that you use in the lunchroom to communicate with one another because you're sort of the minority in your workplace. I mean, many of you know this because when you tell someone you're a Christian, you quickly have to define for them what you mean by that. Why? Because Christianity is no longer the cultural norm in America, especially in San Francisco. Trend number 2 is that church attendance is declining and was declining before COVID. So as you can imagine, as a result of Christianity becoming less and less the cultural norm, you see a direct correlation to church attendance. And this has been happening for decades. In fact, a survey of over 15,000 churches conducted just before COVID shows that between the year 2000 and the year 2020, the median church service attendance dropped from 137 people to 65. In fact, in every age and generational category, Boomer, Gen X, Gen Z, and Millennials, attendance has dropped for the past 20 years. And I've heard a lot of pastors respond to this by blaming everything from sin to the devil to Lady Gaga to the pandemic and pretty much whoever is president. And yet I've not heard many pastors suggest that maybe the reason we have seen decline for the last 20 years is because the model is no longer effective. It's old wineskin. Maybe like old wineskin that's stuck in its ways and cracked, it cannot hold the new thing that God is wanting to do. Maybe this generation doesn't need pastors with tighter jeans and churches with bigger screens and smoke machines, because maybe that model just simply isn't resonating with the world anymore. Perhaps it's time to double down on the mission and experiment with the method. To be wholly committed to our why, but experiment with the what and the how. Because while the boomer generation is hanging on to attending church services, in fact, 71% of boomers say they prefer in-person church services after COVID, according to another Barna survey. But only 41% of Gen Z said that when COVID was officially over, that they would return to primarily in-person worship experiences. And 42% of millennials say they prefer primarily in-person worship experiences as well. And I'm terrible at math, but I'm good enough to know that means the majority of millennials and Gen Z, the future of the church, they don't want to return to a predominantly in-person version of church gatherings, which leads to the third trend. And that is that online community and digital engagement is here to stay. See, there was a day where building community online was seen as weird, but that's not weird anymore. There was a day where dating apps was seen as abnormal, but now it's normal. There was a day where remote work was a luxury that few had, and now it's pretty normal, at least a hybrid version of it. There was a day where you had to wear pants for a morning meeting, and now, thanks to Zoom, you don't have to. You just have to worry about the top half, and that is normal. And there was a day where going to church online wasn't seen as really church. And many still believe that. But now it's becoming more and more normal. Why? Because the digital world is here, and it's here to stay. And this has affected how the church gathers. According to one study, 44% of evangelicals in America wanted to return to in-person church exclusively, meaning that 56% of everyone else wants to keep their options open, and digital spaces have allowed them to do that. Prior to the pandemic, the average person would attend an in-person church service once every 3 to 4 weeks. Now, it's about once every 5 to 6 weeks. Why? Well, there's a few reasons, but I think one is that we have the ability to engage with our church digitally, either through a live stream, watching the teachings on YouTube, and so on. And what we're seeing, especially outside of the church, is that online community is becoming more and more a normative part of our lives. According to a study from Meta, 76% of internet users participate in some sort of online community. That includes like blogs and forums and blogs and more. 76% of all internet users. And 1.8 billion people use groups online every single month. And more than half of that 1.8 billion people using groups, those people are members of 5 or more active groups. And if you're not sold yet that we've pivoted to an online culture, that this is now normal, I just want you to think about your own personal experience. Whether you want to admit it or not, chances are your life flows seamlessly between digital interactions and in-person interactions. I mean, think about it. How do we experience a restaurant before going to the restaurant now? Yelp. How do we connect with a possible mate before actually meeting them and risking an awkward first date? Hinge and other dating apps. I mean, how do we make most of our purchases? Do we go to malls anymore? No, we shop on Amazon or other e-commerce platforms. How do we learn what's happening in the world? Do you read a physical newspaper? Maybe, but most of you probably learn it on Twitter or your news feeds online. How do many of us work out? Fitness apps. I mean, we saw a huge rise in working out at home and digitally because of the pandemic. How do many of us express how we're feeling throughout the day? Emojis and GIFs. Come on, somebody. I don't know how I would communicate without those now. See, our relationship with technology is here to stay. And I believe it will be the same for the future church. Now, I'll be honest. Like many of you, I don't love that. I mean, I want to be clear. I love gathering here in person. And I don't actually think there's anyone on this earth that will say that digital community in the end is better than physical community. I don't think the conversation is whether we do away with in-person. But I think what we're acknowledging is that in-person and digital community are equally important and relevant in our lives. And you may not like that, but here's the thing about culture. Culture never asks our permission to change. It just changes. And we can ignore culture, we can hide from culture, we can fight culture, we can shame culture, And a lot of people do those things. But I think there's a better option. And I think that better option is we use culture to reach culture. We can actually meet people in the culture and bring the hope of Jesus with us there. Sort of like Jesus did when he entered into our space and time and when he became human. And by the way, this isn't the first time that the church has had to be flexible on its method in order to be faithful to the mission. In fact, when Jesus taught in the temple 2,000 years ago, he would have taught on something called the Bema, and everyone listening would have formed this sort of circle around him as he taught. This was the model that worked in the time of Jesus, and so Jesus used that model. But then in the future, Greek theater comes into the picture. And Greek theater influences the church so much so that now we have a stage and people who sit looking in one direction at a stage. Why? Because in Greek theater, they invented this experience and everyone liked it. And so the church at some point shifted its model as well. I could talk about other points in history where the church has adapted to the times. When the light bulb was created, that's another good example. But the truth of the matter is the church has been married to the mission, but it's always dated the method. And if culture changed, they would use culture to reach culture. What if we did the same in this moment we find ourselves in? Which leads me to 3 takeaways that I just think are so important for us as we build the future church for the future generation. And the first one is that the future church must show up as servants, not stakeholders. See, for a while now in America, many Christians have been living like they are stakeholders of some sort of sacred alliance between the church and the state. And some still believe that this alliance is there. But truth of the matter is we aren't stakeholders anymore. We must show up as servants to all, especially those that we may see, or they may see us rather, as an enemy to the culture. See, the cost of living in what is or what currently might be a post-Christian world is that things will not come as easily or as friendly as they might have come in the past. And the church will have to learn how to operate with a balance of courage and humility. It reminds me of what is written in Jeremiah to the nation of Israel when they found themselves as outsiders in pagan Babylon. And Jeremiah doesn't say, grab your picket signs, protest, yell, scream, go to Twitter, let your rage be heard. Here's what Jeremiah says. He says, work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. In other words, hey, put some roots down in this new world you find yourselves in and build it into something better, something more beautiful. Use culture to reach culture, because when you flourish the world that you're in, its welfare becomes your welfare. And here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. He said, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now you should notice Jesus, he says, let them see your good deeds. He doesn't say, let them hear your good deeds, because you know what's even more powerful than telling people they should love their enemies? When you see someone loving their enemies. You know what's more powerful than telling people to trust God? When you see people who trust God deeply. You want to know what's more powerful than telling people on Instagram that you are pro-life? Going out and actually caring for every life from the womb to the tomb. You know what's more powerful than telling people that the teachings of Jesus is the best possible way to live your life? When you actually live the teachings of Jesus and people see the joy, hope, and love that flow from your life. For the future church that is no longer the cultural majority, it will not be our services of people that will be the most impactful as much as our lives of service for people that will truly impact the world around us. What the world needs is not more church services, but more churches committed to service. The future church must show up as servants, not stakeholders. The second takeaway for the future church, based off the trends that we see, is that the future church will need to value engagement more than attendance. We need to value engagement more than attendance. We'll need to measure the health of the church, not by how many people are in rows on Sunday morning, but by how many people are in relationships every day of the week. This doesn't mean that we don't want to grow. It doesn't mean that we don't count anymore. No. It doesn't mean either that like mega churches are somehow bad. There's this narrative that mega churches are all bad and they're going to go away. But you need to know there are bad small churches and there are bad large churches, and there are good small churches and there are good large churches. So I don't care if you count people, as long as we never forget that every person counts. The goal of the future church is to not have a church where everyone knows everybody. That's not what I'm saying. The point is to have a church where everyone is known. The goal is not so that everyone knows everybody, but so that everyone is known. The third takeaway is this: the future church will need to go from Sunday to every day. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the in-person Sunday gathering is important. Let me just be clear. I believe it's theologically important. It's practically important, relationally important, missionally important. I believe it's important. But up until now, for the majority of churches, for us even included before COVID, the Sunday service was central and everything revolved around it. You see, the church tends to focus on 1 hour a week while ignoring the other 167 hours of the week. The future church, I believe, though, will leverage technology to show up and serve the lives of others each and every day. And I'm excited to talk more about this next week as I talk through the disruption of the pandemic and how it has decentralized the Sunday gathering and why I think that's really exciting news for us as a part of the future church. But there is one thing I am so excited to share today that is in alignment with this third takeaway. In order for us as a church to begin to move from Sunday to every day, we're going to be launching something starting tomorrow that I think you're really going to benefit from and is going to be a blessing in your life. If you've been at Canvas for a little bit, you've likely heard me end our Sunday gatherings with what I call a For Monday. It's usually just a takeaway from the teaching of that day to bring the message into the rest of your week. And I get comments all the time from people who ask, what was the For Monday and how can we remember that throughout the week? Just really enjoying the For Mondays. And so I thought, why don't we actually create a space to dive in a little bit deeper and bring the content from the Sunday's teaching into our weeks, bring some applicability to the message, as well as create space to dive in deeper on topics that we may not just have the time to be able to do on a Sunday morning. And so tomorrow, we are launching for the first time ever the For Monday podcast. Come on, somebody. We're launching the For Monday podcast that will live stream every single Monday at 12:15 p.m. on our YouTube channel. It will live stream on YouTube. And then if you can't make the live stream, we will broadcast the audio wherever you listen to podcasts. We're really, really excited about the For Monday podcast. I think it's going to be a great resource for you and a great way for us to move from Sunday to every day. Hey, if you're excited, go ahead and let me know that you're excited about the For Monday podcast in the comments below. But let me end with something that I believe with deep conviction to be true. Like, even with all of the disruption and unknown that the church is facing and will continue to face, I still believe this is true. And what I believe is that the future church is worth fighting for. Come on, do you agree with me? Say amen in the comments there. The future church is worth fighting for. The church has proven again and again throughout the course of history that when it lives like Jesus, that it is an unstoppable and powerful force. And when the church loves like Jesus, it can be a community of healing and transformation. I believe the world needs the church. And if Jesus would believe in people to be the church, then I will believe in it as well. And I will do everything I can to remain a flexible vessel that God can pour new wine into. So as I close, as I was writing this teaching, I found myself thinking back to when news broke in 2019 that the Notre Dame Cathedral was on fire. Do you remember when that happened? It was a heartbreaking scene, and this historic and sacred space went up in flames. And there was even a moment where the steeple fell, and most everyone thought that the Notre Dame was going to be entirely lost. I was reflecting on this and wondering to myself, is this the fate of the church at large? Like, does the whole thing have to burn to the ground? And yet what was interesting was that people gathered when this was happening with candles and they were singing hymns. It was all over the news, which was interesting because Paris is perhaps like the epicenter of modern secularism. If you wake up on a Sunday morning in Paris, most people are not at church. And yet when the Notre Dame was on fire, they weren't cheering. They weren't shouting, "Burn it down." They were weeping. And some of them were even praying. There was not a single person in sight who thought this cathedral going up in flames was a good thing. And that gave me some hope. That even though it might look done from the outside for the church, that there's still hope. That there's still a deep part for many of us that long for God and long for love and long for community and long for the sacred in our world. And there was this really interesting article in the New York Times that said the Notre Dame came within 30 minutes of being completely lost. In fact, if the bell towers would have fallen, everything would have been lost. And a fire company was actually ordered to go up and take these hoses into the bell towers. But this company said no, because it was far too dangerous and not worth the risk of their own lives. And when this happened, another company volunteered. They thought Notre Dame was too important, too sacred to let it burn to the ground. And so they carried all of their gear and all of their hoses and they sprinted up the narrow and winding stairs of the cathedral and up to the bell towers that were up in flames. And it was a heroic effort. And you know, they were able to knock back the flames enough to save the cathedral from total collapse. And you know, I read that to myself and I thought to myself, man, that's what I want to be. I don't want to be the church that says it's not worth the risk or it's too difficult or too intimidating. No, we're living in a time where it can feel like the church is going up in flames, but I don't want to stand outside and yell, "Let it burn," nor do I just want to mourn what has been lost. I want to volunteer to do whatever I can to run towards the flames because I know that the church and ultimately what God's kingdom is doing in the world is too beautiful and too important to let it burn to the ground. I know that we cannot change the history of the church, and the history of the church is anything but perfect. But we can, through God's grace, create the future of the church. And that is our responsibility right now in 2022, to look to the future and decide, will we build a future church that is worth passing on to the future generation? And I'm ready to say yes and be a part of the new thing God is doing. How about you? Let's pray. God, I just thank you so much that even in our imperfections and even in, God, just all of our shortcomings, you don't give up on people. You don't give up on the world. And you certainly have not given up on your mission and on the church. And so, God, I pray that we would be filled with this expectation and hope, that you would resurrect hope and resurrect just this confidence that, God, the future is bright and that you are doing a new thing. But God, help us to be flexible. Help us to not be so set in our ways that we are unable to receive the new that you're wanting to do in and through us. God, we want to build a future church that is actually worth passing on to future generations. So God, break our hearts for what breaks yours. Build us back up to be the church you've called us to be, and lead us into the future, no matter what that looks like, no matter how difficult or how many risks there might be. God, lead us into the future because we want, God, we want to fight for the future of your church because we believe the future of your church is worth fighting for. We love you so much, God. And we ask this in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.